The press conference had been moving along as expected. Donald Trump, standing at the podium, answered questions with his usual confidence. Journalists fired inquiries about policies, upcoming plans, and his recent public appearances. Some were aggressive, others predictable. But then, out of nowhere, a voice from the back cut through the room. "Mr. Trump, do you ever feel like you were born in the wrong body?" For a moment, everything stopped. The murmurs of reporters died down, pens froze mid-scribble, and cameras zoomed in, capturing the slight shift in Trump's expression. No one had ever asked him something like that before. There was a brief silence, the weight of the question settling over the room like an unexpected storm. Journalists exchanged glances, some clearly unsure if they had heard correctly. Even Trump himself seemed momentarily taken aback. The expectation, as always, was that he would fire back with a sharp remark, dismiss the question, or turn it into a joke. But instead, he did something no one saw coming. He paused. For a man known for his quick comebacks and immediate responses, this moment of hesitation sent a ripple of confusion through the room. He looked at the reporter, not with irritation, not with mockery, but with something far more unexpected: thoughtfulness. He adjusted his tie, exhaled lightly, then finally spoke. "You know, that's a very interesting question," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And I'll tell you something. There was a time when I felt like I didn't belong in my own life. Not in my body, but in the world I was in. Like I was constantly trying to prove something even when I wasn't sure what it was." The room, which had moments ago been filled with tension, was now dead silent. "When I was younger, I wasn't the loudest guy in the room. People think I was always this way. Big personality, always in charge. But that's not true. There were times when I wondered if I was even meant for this kind of life." The journalist, clearly expecting a more dismissive or combative response, suddenly looked unsure of what to say. Trump leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto the reporter. "But I learned something," he continued. "Who you are isn't about what other people think you should be. It's about what you decide for yourself." And with that, he had completely flipped the moment. What had started as an attempt to throw him off had turned into something far more profound. The media was stunned. The internet was about to explode. But what happened next? That was what truly changed everything. For the first time in a long while, Donald Trump wasn't speaking to win a debate, to rally a crowd, or to prove a point. He was speaking genuinely, and everyone in the room could feel it. The air was different now, less tense, more expectant. The reporter who had asked the bold question looked just as surprised as everyone else. He had clearly expected a defensive or dismissive response, maybe even a joke at his expense. But instead, Trump had taken a moment that could have gone in any direction and turned it into something deeply personal. "You know," Trump continued, leaning slightly on the podium, "people assume that confidence means you never doubt yourself, that you wake up every day knowing exactly who you are and where you belong. But that's not true. It's not true for me, and it's not true for most people." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every word. Some journalists had lowered their pens, no longer taking notes but simply listening. Even the harshest critics in the room had to admit, this wasn't the usual Trump performance. "When I was younger, I had people tell me who I was supposed to be. My father had expectations, teachers had expectations, the world had expectations. And for a long time I played the role they wanted me to play. But let me tell you something. There's a moment in everyone's life when you have to stop being what people expect and start being who you really are." A few heads nodded in quiet agreement. Some of the younger reporters, many of whom had never covered Trump before, exchanged glances as if re-evaluating the person standing in front of them. The reporter, still standing, cleared his throat. He had been prepared for a different kind of confrontation, but now he had no idea how to follow up. "So, are you saying you ever questioned who you were?" he asked hesitantly. Trump let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm saying that everyone does. If you haven't, then you're either lying to yourself or you're not thinking hard enough." The room remained silent, but this time it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a moment of reflection. Trump had turned a loaded question into an opportunity to talk about something universal, the experience of self-doubt and self-discovery. And just when people thought he had said all he was going to say, he did something even more unexpected. He looked directly at the reporter and asked, "Now, tell me something. Have you ever felt like you weren't where you were supposed to be?" The tables had turned. The media had come for a press conference. Instead, they had found themselves in a conversation they never expected. And what happened next? That was what left everyone in the room completely speechless. The room, once filled with rapid-fire questions and the scribbling of notes, had become eerily silent. Every camera, every microphone, every pair of eyes in the press conference was locked on the reporter, the very same reporter who had tried to catch Trump off guard. But now, the tables had turned. Trump had done something no one expected. He hadn't deflected the question, dismissed it, or turned it into a punchline. Instead, he had answered with raw honesty and, in a surprising twist, thrown a question right back at the reporter. "Have you ever felt like you weren't where you were supposed to be?" The reporter hesitated. His face, which had once carried the confidence of someone looking to land a viral moment, now shifted into something else, something far more personal. He glanced down, the weight of the question suddenly pressing on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He cleared his throat as if trying to regain his footing, but instead of dodging, he did something surprising. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I have." The response sent a ripple through the room. The other reporters, who were expecting either a clash or a cold dismissal, suddenly found themselves witnessing something completely different. A moment of real, unfiltered human connection between a politician and a journalist. Trump leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about it," he said. The reporter shifted on his feet, visibly caught between the professional instinct to keep the spotlight on Trump and the very real pull of the moment. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't come for money," he finally said. "I grew up in a small town. My parents worked long hours just to keep the lights on. I was always told that if I wanted a better life, I had to push myself into places where I didn't belong, where people like me weren't supposed to go." The room, once buzzing with energy, now felt like a closed space where only this conversation mattered. Trump listened carefully. "And do you still feel like you don't belong?" he asked. The reporter let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Every day?" Trump nodded slowly, tapping his fingers on the podium as if considering his next words carefully. "Then you get it," he finally said. "Because that's what life is, pushing past the labels people put on you, finding your own way, even when others think they've already figured out who you are." No one in the room expected this turn of events. The conversation, which had started with a sharp and almost confrontational question, had become something entirely different. And just when everyone thought the moment had peaked, Trump turned back to the rest of the press corps and said something that would dominate the headlines for weeks. What happened next? No one was prepared for it. A press conference was supposed to be a place for quick questions and even quicker answers, but at that moment the room felt different. The usual tension between Donald Trump and the press had shifted into something more real, a conversation about belonging, identity, and the expectations placed on all of us. Trump, standing at the podium, had just listened to the reporter's personal confession. The young journalist, who had initially tried to corner him with a bold question, now found himself unexpectedly vulnerable. admitting his own struggles with self-doubt and feeling out of place. No one had expected the conversation to go this way. Trump took a deep breath and looked around the room. His voice, usually commanding and sharp, softened as he spoke. You see, that's the thing they don't tell you about success. Everyone assumes that once you get to a certain place in life, the doubts go away, that you suddenly belong. But that's not how it works. Not for me, not for you, not for anyone. The reporters weren't scribbling notes anymore. They were just listening. When I first stepped into the world of politics, everyone told me I didn't belong here, he continued. They said I was just a businessman, that I wasn't a career politician, that I didn't fit the mold, and maybe I didn't, maybe I never will. But the truth is, none of us fit perfectly into the places we find ourselves in. We learn, we adapt, we make those places our own. The young reporter, still standing, swallowed hard. It was clear that this was not the answer he had expected. He had likely prepared for a rebuttal, for a moment of defensiveness, for something he could turn into a headline. But now, he had nothing to fire back with. Instead, he nodded slightly, almost as if he was beginning to understand the weight of what was happening. Then Trump did something that caught everyone off guard. So, let me ask you something, he said, looking directly at the reporter. You work hard. You've pushed yourself into places you weren't sure you belonged. But tell me, what do you want? What's your endgame? A murmur spread through the room. This was not how press conferences worked. The reporters were the ones asking the questions, not the other way around. The young journalist hesitated. He shifted on his feet, looking down for a moment before meeting Trump's gaze again. I just want to tell the truth, he said finally. Trump nodded, a small smirk crossing his lips. Then do it, he said. But make sure it's the real truth, not just the version people want to hear. A silence followed, thick with meaning. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about headlines. It was just about being human. And then, just as the room was settling into this unexpected moment, Trump turned back to the rest of the press, and what he said next would send shockwaves across every major network. For a moment, the room was frozen. The energy, once buzzing with anticipation for heated exchanges and political maneuvering, had shifted into something completely different. Donald Trump had just looked a reporter in the eye and told him to seek the truth. Not just the convenient, sensationalized version, but the real, honest truth. Reporters weren't just covering a press conference anymore. They were witnessing something that felt almost unrehearsed, almost too real for the political stage. Trump leaned slightly on the podium, letting his words settle before he spoke again. This time, he wasn't just talking to the young journalist. He was addressing everyone in the room. You know, I get it. I really do. A lot of you in this room don't like me. Some of you probably think I don't deserve to be standing here. And that's fine. But let me ask you something. What are you here for? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Reporters, usually quick to interject, didn't say a word. Some looked at each other, others avoided his gaze. Are you here to get the loudest headline? Are you here to twist a moment into something it's not? Or are you here to actually tell people what's happening in the world? Because let me tell you something, people aren't as dumb as you think they are. They know when they're being fed a story, and they know when they're being told the truth. A few of the more seasoned journalists in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual back-and-forth banter they were used to. This wasn't soundbite politics. Trump had turned the moment into a reflection on the role of the media itself. The young reporter who had started it all remained standing, watching Trump closely. Maybe, just maybe, he realized that what had started as an attempt to put Trump on the spot had led to something much bigger than he intended. Trump exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I don't care if you like me or hate me. I don't care if you agree with me or not. But what I do care about is that we stop playing these games where we twist everything just for ratings. Because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about the people out there, the people who don't sit in press rooms, the people who actually go to work every day and try to make something of themselves. They deserve better. The weight of his words sank into the room. For once, even his critics had to admit he had a point. And then, just when it seemed like the moment had reached its peak, Trump looked back at the young reporter one last time and said something that would turn the entire conversation upside down. You asked me if I ever felt like I was in the wrong body. I'll tell you this. I've never doubted who I am, but I have doubted what this country is becoming, and that's what really keeps me up at night. The press room erupted.